We continue Philopoemen from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Okay, it was a long sentence. Yet, while Aratus lived, they depended much on the Macedonians, courting first Ptolemy, then Antigonus, and Philip, who all took part continually in whatever concerned the affairs of Greece. But when Philopoemen came to a command, the Achaeans, feeling themselves a match for the most powerful of their enemies, declined foreign support. The truth is, Aratus, as we have written in his life, was not of so warlike a temper, but did most by policy and gentleness and friendships with foreign princes. But Philopoemen, being a man both of execution and command, a great soldier, and fortunate in his first attempts, wonderfully heightened both the power and courage of the Achaeans, accustomed to victory under his conduct. But first he altered what he found amiss in their arms and form of battle. Here too they had used light, thin bucklers, too narrow to cover the body, and javelins much shorter than pikes, by which means they were skilful in skirmishing at a distance, but in a close fight had much the disadvantage. Then, in drawing their forces up for battle, they were never accustomed to form in regular divisions, and their line being unprotected either by the thick array of projecting spears or by their shields, as in the Macedonian phalanx, where the soldiers close and their shields touch. Where the soldiers are close and their shields touch, they were easily opened and broken. Philopoemen reformed all this, persuading them to change the narrow target and short javelin into a large shield and a long pike, to arm their heads, bodies, thighs, and legs, and instead of loose skirmishing, fight firmly and foot to foot, after he had brought them all to wear full armor, and by that means, into the confidence of thinking themselves now invincible, he turned what before had been idle profusion and luxury into an honorable expense, for being long used to vie with each other in their dress and furniture of their houses, the servants of their tables, and a glory in outdoing one another, the disease of custom was grown incurable, and there was no possibility of removing it altogether. But he diverted the passion, and brought them, instead of these superfluities, to love useful and more manly display, and reducing their own expenses, to take delight in appearing magnificent in their equipage of war. None then was to be seen in the shops, but plate breaking up, or melting down, gilding of breastplate, and studding bucklers, and bits with silver. Nothing in the places of exercise, but horses mangling, and young men exercising their arms. Nothing in the hands of the women, but helmets and crests of feathers to be dyed, and military cloaks, and riding frocks to be embroidered, the very sight of all which, quickening and raising their spirits, made them contemn dangers, and feel ready to venture on any honorable dangers. Other kinds of sumptuosity gave us pleasure, but make us effeminate. I wonder why there's such a problem of, such a issue of homosexuality amongst them, is that, oh, well, that's more like a woman, and that's more like a woman, and, and the guys like, well, women do that men don't. It's just a logical deduction from that. The tickling of the sense, slackening the vigor of the mind. But magnificence of this kind strengthens and brightens the courage, as Homer makes Achilles at the sight of his new arms, exulting with joy and on fire to use them. And one finds with the homophobia comments too. I'm not saying whether people approve or don't approve of things that oh, that's gay and that's, you know, a lot of people, well, I like this, so I must be gay. Seriously, you know, you meet people all about. I guess maybe there's people who have never heard anybody, you know, make these non-sexual conclusions why they're a particular sexual orientation. But, you know, when Philopoemen had obtained of them to arm and set themselves out in this manner, he proceeded to train them, mustering and exercising them perpetually, in which they obeyed him with a great zeal and eagerness, for they were wonderfully pleased with their new form of battle, which being so knit and cemented together, seemed almost incapable of being broken. And then their arms, which, for their riches and beauty, they were with pleasure becoming light and easy to them with constant use, they longed for nothing more than to try them with an enemy and fight in earnest. The Achaeans at that time were at war with the Achaemenidas, the tyrant of Lacedaemon, who, having a strong army, watched all opportunities of becoming entire master of Peloponnesus, when intelligence came that he was fallen upon the Mantiaeans, that he was fallen upon the Mantiaeans. Philopoemen forthwith took the field and marched towards him. They met near Mantinea and drew up in sight of the city. Both besides the whole strength of their several cities had a good number of mercenaries in pay, and when they came to fall on Machinidas with his hired soldiers, beat the spearmen and the Tarentines whom Philopoemen had placed in the front. But when he should have charged immediately into the main battle, which stood close and firm, he hotly followed the chase, and instead of attacking the Achaeans, passed on behind them. Beyond them. While they, beyond, then you're behind them, right? While they remained drawn up in their place, with so untoward a beginning, the rest of the Confederates gave themselves up for lost, but Philopoemen, professing to make it a matter of small consequence, and observing the enemy's oversight, who had thus left an opening in their main body and exposed their own phalanx, made no sort of motion to oppose them, but let them pursue the chase freely till they had placed themselves at a great distance from him. Then, seeing the Lacedaemonians before him deserted by their horse, with their flanks quite bare, he charged suddenly and surprised them without a commander, and not so much as expecting an encounter as when they saw Achaemenidas driving the beaten enemy before him. They thought the victory already gained. He overthrew them with a great slaughter. They report about 4,000 killed in the place, and then faced about against Machinidas, who was returning with his mercenaries from the pursuit. There happened to be a broad, deep ditch between them, alongside of which both rode their horses for a while, the one trying to get over and fly, the other to hinder him. It looked less like the contest between two generals than like the last defense of some wild beast brought to bay by the keen huntsman Philopoemen, and forced to fight for his life. The tyrant's horse was mettled and strong, and feeling the bloody spurs in his sides, ventured to take the ditch. He had already so far reached the other side as to have planted his 4 feet upon it, and was struggling to raise himself with these, when Sybias and Palaenas, who used to fight by the side of Philopoemen, came up upon a horseback to his assistance. But Philopoemen, before either of them himself made Machanidas, and perceiving that the horse with his head highly reared covered his master's body, turned his own a little, and holding his javelin by the middle, drove it against the tyrant with all his force, and tumbled him dead into the ditch. Such is the precise posture in which he stands at Delphi in the brazen statue which the Achaeans set up of him in admiration of his valor in this single combat and conduct during the whole day. We are told that at the Nemean games, a little after this victory, Philopoemen, being then general, the second time, and at leisure on the occasion of the solemnity, first showed the Greeks his army, drawn up in full array as if they were to fight, and executed with it all the maneuvers of a battle with wonderful order, strength, and celerity. After which he went into the theatre, while the musicians were singing for the prize, followed by the young soldiers in their military cloaks and their scarlet frocks under their armor, all in the very height of bodily vigor, and much alike in age, showing a high respect to their general, yet breathing at the same time a noble confidence in themselves, raised by success in many glorious encounters. Just at their coming in, it so happened that the musician Pilatus, with a voice well suited to the lofty style of poet, was in the act of commencing the Persians of Timotheus. Under his conduct, Greece was glorious and was free. The whole theatre at once turned to look at Philopoemen, and clapped with delight, their hopes venturing once more to return to their country's former reputation, and their feelings almost rising to the height of their ancient spirit. It was with the Achaeans as with young horses, which go quietly with their usual riders, but grow unruly and restive under strangers. The soldiers, when any service was in hand, and Philopoemen not at their head, grew dejected, and looked about for him. But if he once appeared, came presently to themselves, and recovered their confidence and courage, being sensible that this was the only one of their commanders whom the enemy could not endure to face, but as appeared in several occasions, were frightened with his very name. Thus we find that Philip, king of Macedon, thinking to terrify the Achaeans into subjection again, if he could rid his hands of Philopoemen, employed some persons privately to assassinate him. But the treachery coming to light, he became infamous and lost his character through Greece. The Boeotians, besieging Megara and ready to carry the town by storm, upon a groundless rumor that Philopoemen was at hand with succor, ran away and left their scaling ladders at the wall behind him. Nabis, who was tyrant of Lacedaemon after Machanidas had surprised Messene at a time when Philopoemen was out of command, he tried to persuade Lysippus, then general of the Achaeans, to succor Messene, but not prevailing with him, because he said, the enemy being now within it, the place was irrecoverably lost. He resolved to go himself without order or commission. He followed merely by his own immediate fellow citizens, who went with him as their general by commission from nature, which had made him fittest to command. No equity here. Rising the ranks via, equality. That, oh, hey, this guy's doing well, so let's move him up the ranks, like, well, who cares if he's not rich or noble or something? Let's just move him up. Nabis, hearing of coming, thought it not convenient to stay, but stealing out of the furthest gate with his men, marched away with all the speed he could, thinking himself a happy man if he could get off with safety. And he did escape. By Messene was rescued. All hitherto makes for the praise and honor of Philopoemen, but when, at the request of the Cortunians. He went away into Crete to command for them at a time when his own country was distressed by Nabis. He exposed himself to the charge of either cowardice or unseasonable ambition of honor amongst foreigners, for the megalopolitans. The megalopolitans. Okay, how do you? I don't know how that's supposed to be spelled. Megalopolitans, probably. Again, I don't have Greek spellings here, so or we're not even sure about the Latin because this is a translation, so sometimes the Latin spelling is changed too. Were then so pressed that the enemy being master of the field and encamping almost at their gates, they were forced to keep themselves within their walls, and so their very streets, and in the meantime across the seas, waging war and commanding in chief with a foreign nation, furnished his ill-wishers with matter enough for their reproaches. Now, what's that song like from the 80s? The Over the Sea, but that's not the right tone. It's some ridiculous. It was entertaining, but it was on that BBC Celt series too. In the meantime, across the seas, waging war and commanding in chief in a foreign nation, furnished his ill-wishers with matter enough for their reproaches. Some said he took the offer of the Cortunians, because the Achaeans chose other generals and left him but a private man, for he could not endure to sit still, but looking upon war and command in it as his greatest business, always coveted to be employed, and this agrees with what he once aptly said of King Ptolemy. Somebody was praising him for keeping his army and himself in an admirable state of discipline and exercise. And what praise, replied Philopoemen, for a king of his years to be always preparing and never performing. However, the Megalopolitans, thinking themselves to be betrayed, took it so ill that they were about to banish him. But the Achaeans put an end to that design by sending their general, Ristaus, to Megalopolis, who, though he were at difference with the Philopoemen about affairs of the Commonwealth, yet he would not suffer him to be banished. Philopoemen, finding himself upon this account out of favor with his citizens, induced divers of the little neighboring places to renounce obedience to them, suggesting to them to urge that from the beginning they were not subject to their taxes or laws, or any way under their command. In these pretenses he openly took their part, and fomented seditious movements among the Achaeans in general against the Megalopolis. But these things happened a while after. While he stayed in Crete, in the service of the Cortunians, he made war, not like a Peloponnesian and Acarnanian, fairly in the open field, but fought with them at their own weapon, and turned their stratagems and tricks against themselves, showed themselves they played craft against skill, and were but children to an experienced soldier, having acted here with great bravery and great reputation to himself, he returned into Peloponnesus, where he found Philip beaten by Titus Quintius, and Nepes at war both with the Romans and Achaeans. He was at once chosen general against Nepes, but venturing to fight by sea, met, like Epaminondas, with a result very contrary to the general expedition and his own former reputation. Epaminondas, however, according to some statements, was backward by design, unwilling to give his countrymen an appetite for the advantages of the sea, lest from the good soldiers it should by little and little turn, as Plato says, to ill mariners, and therefore he returned from Asia and the islands without doing anything on purpose, whereas Philopoemen, thinking his skill in land service would equally avail at sea, learned how great a part of valor experience is, and how much it imparts in the management of things to be accustomed to them, for he was not only put to the worst in the fight for the want of skill, but having rigged up an old ship which had been a famous vessel 40 years before and shipped his citizens in her, she foundering, he was in danger of losing them all, but finding the enemy as if he had been driving out of the sea, had in contempt of him besieged Guthium, he presently set sail again, and taking them unexpectedly, dispersed and careless after their victory, landed in night, burnt their camp, and killed a great number. A few days later, as he was marching through a rough country, Nabis came suddenly upon him. The Achaeans were dismayed, and in such difficult ground where the enemy had secured the advantage, despaired to get off with safety. Philopoemen made a little halt, and viewing the ground soon made it appear that the one important thing in war is skill in drawing up an army, for by advancing only a few paces, and without any confusion or trouble, altering his order according to the nature of the place, he immediately relieved himself from every difficulty, and then charging, put the enemy to flight. But when he saw they fled, not towards the city, but dispersed every man a different way all over the field, which, for wood and hills, brooks and hollows, was not passable by horse, he sounded a retreat, and encamped by broad daylight. Then foreseeing the enemy would endeavor to steal scatteredly into the city in the dark, he posted strong parties of the Achaeans all along the watercourses and sloping ground near the walls. Many of Nabis's men fell into their hands, for returning not in a body, but as the chance of flight had disposed of every one, they were caught like birds ere they could enter into the town. These actions obtained him distinguished marks of affection and honor in all the theaters of Greece, but not without the secret ill will of Titus Flaminius. Titus Flaminius, who was naturally eager for glory, and thought it but a reasonable consul of Rome should be otherwise esteemed by the Achaeans than a common Arcadian, especially as there was no comparison between what he and what Philopoemen had done for them, he having by one proclamation restored all Greece, as much as had been subject to Philip and the Macedonians, to liberty. After this, Titus made peace with Nabis, and Nabis was circumvented and slain by the Attalians. Things being done in confusion at Sparta, Philopoemen laid hold of the occasion, and coming upon them with an army, prevailed, with some by persuasion, with others by fear, till he brought the whole city over to the Achaeans, as it was no small matter for Sparta to become a member of Achaea. Thus, this action gained him infinite praise from the Achaeans, and having strengthened their confederacy by the additions of so great and powerful a city, and not a little goodwill from the nobility of Sparta itself, who hoped that they now procured an ally who would defend their freedom. Accordingly, having raised a sum of 120 silver talents by the sale of the house and goods of Nabis, they decreed him the money, and sent him a deputation in the name of the city to present it. But here the honesty of Philopoemen showed itself clearly to be a real uncounterfeited virtue, for, first of all, there was not a man among them who would undertake to make him this offer of a present, but every one excusing himself and shifting it off upon his fellow. They laid the office at last upon Timolaus, with whom he had lodged at Sparta. Then Timolaus came to Megalopolis and was entertained by Philopoemen, but struck into admiration with the dignity of his life and manners, and the simplicity of his habits, judging him to be utterly inaccessible to any such considerations, he said nothing but pretending other business, returned without a word mentioned of the present. He was sent again, and did just as formerly, but the third time with much ado, and faltering in his words, he acquainted Philopoemen with the goodwill of the city of Sparta to him. Philopoemen listened obligingly and gladly, and then went himself to Sparta, where he advised them not to bribe good men and their friends, of whose virtue they might be sure without charge to themselves, but to buy off and silence ill citizens who disquieted the city with their seditious speeches in the public assemblies. For it was better to bar liberty of speech in enemies than friends. Well, encourage control of their speech and friends, but obviously forcing it on enemies, right? So these people, we're going to censor you. Yeah, if you're slandering people or something like that, but not having a different opinion can be discussed. Thus, it appeared how much Philopoemen was above bribery. Diophantus, being afterwards general of the Achaeans, and hearing the Lacedaemonians were bent on new commotions, resolved to chastise them. They, on the other side, being set upon war, were embroiling all Peloponnesus. Philopoemen, on this occasion, did all he could to keep Diophantus quiet, and to make him sensible that, as the times went, while Antiochus and the Romans were disputing their pretensions with vast armies in the heart of Greece, it concerned a man in his position to keep a watchful eye over them, and dissembling and putting up with any less important grievances, to preserve all quiet at home. Diophantus would not be ruled, but joined with Titus, and both together, falling into Deconia, marched directly to Sparta. Philopoemen, upon this, took in his indignation a step which certainly was not lawful, nor in the strictest sense just, but boldly and loftily conceived. Entering into the town himself, he, a private man as he was, refused admission to both the consul of Rome and the general of the Achaeans, quieted the disorders in the city, and reunited it on the same terms as before to the Achaean confederacy. Yet afterwards, when he was general himself, upon some new misdemeanor of the Lacedaemonians, he brought back those who had been banished, but as Polybius writes, 80 according to aristocrats, 350 Spartans to death, razed the walls, took away a good part of their territory, and transferred it to the Megalopolitans, forced out of the country, and carried into Achaia all who had been made citizens of Sparta by tyrants, except 3,000 who would not submit to banishment. Thus, these he sold for slaves, and with the money, as if to exult over them, built a colonnade at Megalopolis. Lastly, unworthily trampling upon the Lacedaemonians in the calamities, and gratifying his hostility by a most oppressive and arbitrary action, he abolished the laws of Lycurgus, and forced them to educate their children and live after the manner of the Achaeans, as though, while they kept to the discipline of Lycurgus, there was no humbling their haughty spirits. And it's a very important thing that we encounter is that very often the conquered people, no matter how long they're staying conquered, they stick to their identity. There's still that identity that they're trying to bring back into, autonomy of their nation or their tribe. The Greeks and the Romans are pretty good examples, is most of the areas that they ruled gave up the Greek and Roman identity. And we can think of countries in my lifetime that's when they gained their independence. They again, in their present distress and adversity, they allowed Philopoemen thus to cut the sinews of their commonwealth asunder, and to behave themselves humbly and submissively, but afterwards, in no long time, obtaining the support of the Romans, they abandoned their new Achaean citizenship, and, as much as in so miserable and ruined a condition they could re-establish their ancient discipline. When the war betwixt Antiochus and the Romans broke out in Greece, Philopoemen was a private man. He repined grievously when he saw Antiochus lay idle at Chalcis, spending his time in unreasonable courtship and weddings, while his men lay dispersed in several towns without order or commanders, and minding nothing but their pleasures. He complained much that he was not himself in office, and said he envied the Romans their victory, and that if he had had the fortune to be then in command, he would have surprised and killed the whole army in taverns. When Antiochus was overcome, the Romans pressed harder upon Greece, and encompassed the Achaeans with their power. The popular leaders in the several cities yielded before them, and their power speedily, under the divine guidance, advanced to the consummation due to it in the revolution of fortune. Philopoemen, in this conjuncture, carried himself like a good pilot in a high sea, sometimes shifting sail and sometimes yielding, but still steering steadily, and omitting no opportunity neither effort to keep all who were considerable, whether for eloquence or riches, fast to the defense of their common liberty. Now, particularly amongst people drinking, you hear of accounts, and you encounter drunks too, or at least people who are still under the influence, bragging about what you would call war crimes. And it doesn't, well, very often in the country that that such and such people are, the thing isn't considered war crime because the army allowed it, right? And the army never decided to charge the person for what they did to women or children or unarmed people or, but it doesn't fix the problem. And it's like, why are you drinking if you're supposed to have these religious values or something, why are you doing intoxicants with these people? And then you hear what they do. It takes the credit off of some of the responses that make the news. But those responses aren't really the answer anyways. It's if you can convince people to not be involved, that builds up, or not be supportive of these actions. It can affect more people, Aristaeus, Megalopolitan, of great credit among the Achaeans, but always a favorer of the Romans, saying one day in the Senate that the Romans should not be opposed or displeased in any way. Philopoemen heard him with an impatient silence, but at last, not able to hold longer, said angrily to him, "And why be in such haste, wretched man, to hold the end of Greece?" Manius, the Roman consul, after the defeat of Antiochus, requested the Achaeans to restore the banished Lacedaemonians to their country, which motion was seconded and supported by all the interest of Titus, but Philopoemen crossed it, not from ill will to the men that they might be beholden to him, and the Achaeans, not to Titus and the Romans, for when he came to be general himself, he restored them, So impatient was his spirit of any subjection, and so prone his nature to contest everything with men in power. Being now 70, and 8th time general, he was in hope to pass in quiet not only the year of his magistracy, but his remaining life. Not only the year of his magistracy, but his remaining life. For as our diseases decline, as it is supposed with our declining bodily strength, so the quarreling humor of the Greeks abated much with their failing political greatness. But fortune, or some divine retributive power, threw him down in the close of his life, like a successful runner who stumbles at the goal. It is reported that being in a company where one was praised for a great commander, he replied, there was no great account to be made of a man who had suffered himself to be taken alive by his enemies. Well, don't always have a choice, do you? You know, a few days after, news came that Dinocrates the Messenian, a particular enemy to Philopoemen, and for his wickedness and villainies generally hated, had induced Messene to revolt from the Achaeans, and was about to seize upon a little place called Colonis. Philopoemen lay then sick of a fever at Argos. Upon the news he hastened away and reached Megalopolis, which was distant above 400 furlongs in a day. From thence he immediately laid out the horse, the noblest of the city, young men in the vigor of their age and eager to proffer